Welcome, everyone. I am wrapping up season 8, The Recruiter's Perspective, with a highlights episode so that you can get the top tips and advice that I heard from the recruiters that I interviewed. If you're not already, please subscribe to the podcast or YouTube channel to be notified when episodes go live. And I'd love to connect with you on LinkedIn. I will leave a link in the show notes. For those who are new here, my name is Julia, and I'm a career coach and strategist with over 10 years of experience helping professionals find clarity in their career and aligning their values to their work. I want to help you control your career and create a career that fits who you are and what you need in this season of your life. For more information on coaching, courses, and free career resources, head over to ridethetidecollective.com. So I want to start this episode out with a story, and it's an embarrassing one. So just get ready for that. Those of us who work in the career sector are not void of having embarrassing situations happen to us, and I am going to share mine. So I want to tell you a story about the first time that I worked with a recruiter. I was in my early 20s, and I was in a space where I was extremely confused about who I was and my talents. My education, internships, and early career had been in the arts, but it wasn't enough for me. And during a transition period, someone suggested that I work with a placement agency. For those unfamiliar, a placement agency at that time is similar to what we call a recruitment agency now. Basically, it's an organization that helps place you in the best job based on your skills and their opportunities. They know what the client is looking for, and they suggest the best person for the job. At that time, I considered being a personal assistant. This was because I was organized and I wanted more variety in my job. And I was still young, so it was something that I felt was within my ability to do. I reached out to a recruiter who placed personal assistants in the Los Angeles area, and I submitted my not so great resume. I was able to secure a phone call with a lead recruiter, but instead of talking about myself and talking myself up and asking good questions, I basically dumped all of my career issues and woes onto her. It was not good. It was probably one of the most embarrassing experiences I've had in my career history. Basically, I used our conversation as therapy to share all these things that I was thinking about my career, and I was all over the place. The result was I never got called for a job. At that time, I didn't understand the role that an agency recruiter played in the job search process, and really didn't understand what a recruiter did at all. So my story, along with the frustration I've seen many professionals share of the recruiting process, is what led me to have a season dedicated to interviewing recruiters. This episode, as I said, is a collection of the wisdom and tips that they shared with me, along with my own tips and career advice as a career coach. But before I get into all the wisdom that these recruiters shared with me over 8 episodes, I want to define different types of recruiters for you and their role in the hiring process, just so that there's some clarity around what they do. So first is an agency recruiter. This is the type of recruiter I just described in my story. A company hires them to find talent and match people to positions. This can happen at any level, and most agencies specialize in an industry or a functional area. So if you think about an executive recruiter or a tech recruiter, supply chain recruiter, a lot of times they are specific agencies, though they can also be within an organization as well. Next is a temp agency. Similar to an agency recruiter, people are hired by the agency to work for an organization, but they are being paid by the agency, not the organization. Temp agency work can be a great option if you need to get out of a position, but you don't want to commit to anything long-term. Temp agencies are usually targeted toward more monotonous, lower-level positions, but not always. Then we have internal recruiters, which I think is the most common that people see today. These are recruiters who work for an organization and only recruit for that organization. Depending on the size and structure of the organization, internal recruiters can focus on certain functional areas, or recruit for all functional areas. Within the internal recruiting system, there can be full cycle recruiters who see the process through from sourcing to hiring, so from beginning to end. You might be in contact with somebody who only sources jobs, and this is somebody who is looking for quality and qualified candidates and encouraging them to apply, but they're not necessarily seeing that person through the entire process. They're just trying to get people to apply into a position. And then we also have the hiring manager. In some companies, the hiring manager will actually manage the bulk of the recruiting process in partnership with human resources. Again, it just depends on the organization and the structure that they have. But every type of recruiter will have a different perspective and a different level of involvement in the hiring process. Having a basic understanding of the roles will help you know who you're speaking with and what to expect for the most part. The recruiters I interviewed for this season span multiple types of recruiters to ensure that you see different perspectives and processes. So let's start with the highlights and basically what stuck out for me throughout the season. So these might be things that I heard consistently and just advice that I think was really key throughout these interviews. First is the cover letter. And this was a question that I asked intentionally because there is so much noise about cover letters right now. But including a cover letter was 50-50 with these recruiters. I noticed that the recruiters who were in tech didn't ask for one or expect one, especially for skills-based individual contributor positions. Since the majority of the recruiters had recruited in various areas and levels throughout their own career, the consensus was that the roles that required written communication were management level positions, or if you were a career changer, the cover letter would likely be helpful in those instances, and in some cases might be required. One of my favorite quotes is from Jordan Hallow. He's the director of recruitment for Northwestern Mutual. He said, "Do I love cover letters? Yes, I do. Do I think they're necessary? No, I don't." So you want to keep that in mind. Cover letters are really specific to a position, sometimes to a person, and I would just be mindful of what the job description is asking for. The second thing that stood out to me was the use of LinkedIn. And you know, I preach LinkedIn all the time. I have a course dedicated to optimizing your LinkedIn profile and outreach strategy. And every recruiter talked about the benefit of LinkedIn to not only source candidates, but also how they've used it in their own personal career advancement. So one thing to note that was emphasized by pretty much everyone was the need to completely fill out your profile and make sure that you add content to your positions. And again, if you've been listening to me for any amount of time, you know that that is something that I emphasize as well. And as a career coach, I see this a lot when I'm searching on LinkedIn or I'm networking on LinkedIn. And here's my advice. Use the About section to share big career wins, your passion, your basic career story, and or anything that will help set you apart. And including keywords is helpful, but don't let it become a dumping ground for keywords. I see that so much. Skills need context, and that's what a lot of the recruiters were looking for. Is it's great that you can list the skill, but how have you used it? So that leads me to my second piece of advice for LinkedIn. Use the description section for your positions to highlight how you have used certain skills in each position. So include impactful accomplishments, make sure your content builds your credibility and highlights skills for where you're headed next. So if you have past positions that don't relate to where you want to go in the future, don't add a description, or if you do, make sure you highlight the transferable skills that'll be useful for where you want to go. Remember, you can always adjust your language on LinkedIn to fit what you need it to be for the next transition. LinkedIn can always be updated, and it's really a living space for you. And as I interviewed recruiters, I wanted to make sure that I got their tips and advice when it came to writing your resume, interviewing, and the job search in general. So again, those two big pieces of information that I took away from each one is how we feel about cover letters and then the use of LinkedIn. That is the top of what I saw consistently throughout the interviews. So now I want to get into some of the specifics that I asked about. Again, resume, interviewing, and the job search in general. There is so much information out there, and it can be hard to know who to listen to. And so I compiled the advice and specifically what was repeated multiple times or emphasized throughout all of the interviews. So let's go through it. And I'll let you know, this is not a comprehensive list of everything. This is just the top things that stuck out that I saw multiple people talk about. So let's talk about resumes. And for those who don't know, I actually have a resume guide specifically for mid-level career. And I had some of the recruiters actually read through it and make sure that all of my content and my advice was on point. So I got that vetted through them, and I'm really excited about that. So if you want more information for that, I will leave a link in the blog post for this episode. So let's get into resume advice. The top thing that I heard pretty much from everybody was metrics. What that means is when we're writing accomplishment statements, when you're writing your content under each position, you need to add metrics, you need numbers, you need results of some kind. So even if it's not necessarily a numbers oriented type position, there still needs to be results. So you really want to think about that when you're writing content for your resume. Don't lie. Yeah, that was said. Don't lie. And the reason is what happens is you lie on your resume, you come in for an interview, they can tell. They can tell that you've lied. So don't lie. Don't exaggerate the truth. It's one thing to use different language to emphasize what you've done. It's another thing to blatantly lie about what you've put in your resume and your experience. Think about times where you've gone above and beyond, right? And so when we talk about accomplishment statements, that's the phrase that I use. When have you really stood out? And sometimes those skills will align with the position, but sometimes they won't. Sometimes it's something that you want to highlight where you have done more than was required, but that aligns with the position. Don't use paragraphs. This was definitely something that was said a few times. I know some people advise that way. I heard multiple times not to use paragraphs, and I would agree with that. I don't recommend paragraphs in any fashion. It's very hard to read. Get your resume reviewed. So this is a little hit or miss for me. I think the reason that this was talked about is because people are seeing a lot of grammatical errors. So in that regard, if grammar is something that is difficult for you, then definitely get your resume reviewed. Do you need to pay somebody to review your resume? I don't think so. I think that you can find a couple of trusted people within your network and have them read through it to see if anything glaring comes out to them. You can use things like Grammarly to point out, major mistakes, things like that. So don't think that you need to pay for that. Look to your network, see if you have some trusted people who would do that for you. And then less is more. And I really love this because I think sometimes we get really caught up in what in our experiences, and we want to share everything because it was important to us. It was important to our journey, but it's not important to the recruiter and it's not important to the hiring manager. So you really have to detach and stay focused when you're writing your resume so that you're not adding a bunch of extra information that doesn't matter for the position. This is why sometimes you'll end up with multiple versions of your resume because you'll highlight different things depending on the position or the functional area that you're applying for. All right, interview advice. I feel like interview advice is not talked about as much as it should be. There's a lot of emphasis put on the resume as a gateway to the interview, which I think is great. But the actual interview process is really the make it or break it part of the job search process and what you're going through. And I wanted to make sure that I got some really tangible advice around interviewing, what people are looking for and where people are falling short. And so I have a number of things I'm going to share, and I'll expand on them as well. So first is using the STAR method, and there's a lot of different ways to answer questions out there. The STAR method is specifically used for behavioral questions, and so quite a few people mentioned that they talk about behavioral questions. These are questions that we're trying to elicit a behavior. They're trying to see how you manage in a situation. I'm not going to go in depth with the STAR method. I actually have a podcast episode that outlines it. So I'll link that into the blog post for this episode so that you can get more detail on that. But basically what I heard multiple times is make sure that your information and your stories are organized. So that's what you want to think about. Research the company, and I'll add research the company in general, but try to research the position, people who have been in it before you, people you might be working with, your manager. Research as much as you can, because people can tell when you haven't done your homework. This is another reason not to apply to hundreds and hundreds of positions, because you need to be able to walk into an interview and be ready to talk about it. And you want to know that the company is a good fit. And so doing that research up front to make sure there isn't a values misalignment is really important just in the long run. Asking questions. This was mentioned multiple times that a lot of people are not asking questions at different stages within the interview process. And so have questions ready to go. And that can be questions that come up within that interview. It can be pre-slated questions. I have another podcast episode on that, so I'll link that as well. But you need to be asking questions to get as much information as possible. So it really is true that you're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing you. So make sure that you ask really good questions and have those prepared. And problem solving. So this kind of goes along with the STAR method, but essentially they're going to be asking you questions about how you solve problems. And so in preparation for an interview, you want to think about what are problems that you have solved in your position, in your past positions, and have some notes on that so that you're ready to talk about those experiences, because most questions can be answered if you're describing a time where you solved a problem. Okay, this is specifically for video, but also in person. I think it applies to both, but for video, it gets overlooked more. Be aware of nonverbals. So be aware of, you notice I talk with my hands a lot. That happens on video and off. Think about your posture, even on a video. Think about your facial expressions. Think about what you're saying when you're not saying anything, right? So just be aware of that. Be aware of what's happening in your background. All of that you want to be aware of. Again, if you're on video, be aware of your background. But if you're in person, it's the same way. How are you shaking somebody's hand? How are you carrying yourself? Be aware of those nonverbals. The next bit of advice comes from Nick, who works at Slack, and he's a technical recruiter, and he's a pretty experienced recruiter as well. And I really love the way that he talked about this. He said to show a progression of skills if you're more experienced. So I loved that. When you're dealing with 10 plus years of experience, you want to show that you've really amped up your skill set and the growth there. If you have less experience, right? So you're a new professional, maybe you're switching functional areas, something like that. Show your motivation and potential. And I think your excitement for the position, that goes a long way. What have you learned? Talking about the ability to learn and the ability to adapt into new situations, I think is really important when you have less experience. Another piece of advice, and this was specific to one of the recruiters, Ellie Jameson. She works for Cloudflare, and she works specifically with college students university student. She's a university recruiter. And I loved this advice that she gave. She said, talk to someone before an interview so that you're ready to have a conversation. And I know some of you out there who are a little bit more introverted would say, oh no, I don't want to talk to anybody. I want to be internal. I want to be in my world to prepare. And I think that's fine. But I think there's something to this. I think there's something to, even as an introvert, I'm an introvert, to just having a quick conversation with somebody to get out some of those nerves. And I think especially if you're doing a lot of video interviewing, if you have a spouse, a partner, a roommate, something like that, like just have a quick conversation with them because you want to relax. You need to relax a little bit. And sometimes having a quick conversation is helpful. So I really loved that piece of advice that she gave. All right. So the other thing that I asked was just general advice and tips that these recruiters had. And so I wanted to highlight some of the pieces of our conversations that I thought were really relevant and in some cases specific to the areas that they recruited in, but I still thought was a good conversation to have across the board. So first one comes from Nick again. We were talking about certifications in relation to tech positions because there are so many certifications out there. And there was a lot of misinformation around if you do this certification, you'll get this job. And the reality was that Nick shared with us is certifications don't guarantee a position. And I think that that's something to remember for those of you who might be seeking certifications in order to change career paths and all of that. Those certifications have to come with some type of experience. Even if you have experience in another functional area, you got to merge those things together. So just don't get caught up in the hype of certifications. They can be good to supplement, but they're not necessarily going to guarantee anything. Quite a few of the recruiters worked on both the agency side as well as being internal recruiters for one organization. So I'd recommend going through and listening to all the episodes because I try to get perspective. If they did have agency experience, we talked about the difference between the two. So I can tell you that Nick, Mary Kate, Adrian, and Kai are the ones that have experience in both. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely check out those interviews. Pay attention to details. This kind of goes more into the resume, but I think across the board, when you're applying, when you're communicating with people, just pay attention to the details, make sure that dates line up, read the job descriptions for details, and ask good questions. Ghosting. This was something I talked about with a couple of the recruiters because, again, I was seeing a lot of people talking about being ghosted by recruiters. And one thing, I think it was Kai shared, ghosting goes both ways. And quite a few of the recruiters actually talked about how they would set up interviews with people and they wouldn't show up. So I understand that a lot of people are dealing with recruiters who are ghosting them, but recruiters are also dealing with candidates who are ghosting them. So understanding that it goes both ways and it's not just the candidates that are frustrated, but it's the recruiters as well. And, we're all human, right? We're all human. If for some reason you have to miss an interview and it's within your ability, just shoot them an email, right? And I think for any recruiter that's listening to this, experience goes a long way here. I think a lot of recruiters are inundated with communication and it's just hard. And depending on the policies within the organization, you just might not hear from them. Sometimes it's the hiring manager that keeps everybody on edge. You just never know. And so following up, communicating as best you can on both sides would be my recommendation. Along that same route, following up, I think that was one thing that I heard consistently throughout the interviews. It's okay to follow up unless there's explicit communication not to. For most mid-size and small companies, you can communicate with the recruiters and it's fine. They're happy to update you. They're happy to keep you posted on what's going on. So don't be afraid to follow up. One thing that I thought I would hear more about, but I didn't. Mary Kate Beck is the one that actually talked about this, and she works for Salesforce. But one of the things that she said was getting a referral into the company. So there are some companies that actually want people to refer in. They want their current employees to refer people into the company, and they compensate for that. It depends on the company, but a lot of times they use that as a way to help find really good, really top talent. So if you have a company that operates under referrals, do that. In Mary Kate's experience with Salesforce, if a referral comes in, she has to deal with that person immediately. They have, I think it's a week turnaround to communicate and get them through kind of the early part of the interview process if they're a referral. So don't underestimate the power of a referral. Definitely try to get it when you can. One other thing that was talked about was the confusion around job description language. And this will likely be different per company, but I'm going to share, again, this was Mary Kate that talked about this because she recruits a lot for remote positions. And I think Slack is remote too. I think most of their positions are remote as well. But one of the things that she was saying was to pay attention to the language that is used specifically for remote positions. So the example that she gave was if it says Colorado remote, it means that you need to live in that area. So you need to live in Colorado, but you'll be remote. You won't be required to come into the office. And some of that is because they're looking for people regionally. They want people to be in the region and live in the region or live in the state, but you can still work at home. If it says remote US or remote with no specification, then likely you can live anywhere. In some cases, you can't live internationally. You'd have to check that out. But just be mindful of those details, and then always ask if you get to the interview process, always ask about that specifically. And in some cases, if you can ask ahead of time, that would be recommended to make sure that you're not wasting anybody's time. And then finally, I want to talk about the ATS, the applicant tracking system. There is a lot of information out there around ATS and what it can do and what it can't do. It was confirmed to me multiple times. There is no auto reject. There is no auto reject function. So what happens in an applicant tracking system is there are filters that are being used. So a recruiter will go in, they will filter through. If you don't meet certain criteria, that's when you're going to get that email, but it's not an automatic thing. There's somebody actually going in. I think when you're getting emails at all times during the day, a lot of times when it comes to that, especially larger companies, when it comes to that first line, they have people who work all over the place who are in there and constantly combing through applications. So that's what you need to remember. All the recruiters that I spoke to, they said there is no algorithm. There is nothing. It's a filter that we use. We're looking for specific things, and that's what it is. So one thing to remember through all of this, and I mentioned this earlier, everybody has a preference. And so I shared some of the recruiter's perspective with you, but there's also the hiring manager perspective as well. And sometimes those don't align. They don't go together. Sometimes the recruiters are having to deal with hiring managers' expectations, and it's hard. And this happens in the same organization. I've heard this from recruiters just as I've talked with them individually, not necessarily in these interviews. But I'm assuming if you're listening to this, you are searching for a new opportunity. And I want to remind you that recruiters are human too. So again, they have their own preferences. They have their own things that they're dealing with within their organization and within their job. They are doing their job the same way that you do your job. And I'll be honest, some are better than others. Some are still learning. There's recruiting in some instances is a very entry level position. So sometimes people are still in that learning process and they don't know how to communicate well. They haven't had the training, they haven't had the experience. And honestly, some are stuck in old habits. But at the end of the day, they're still people. And what I loved here is I had a mix of newer recruiters and more experienced recruiters. And I think across the board, this group really cares about people. They want to see people get into the right positions. They want to help. That's part of why they came on and they did this podcast season with me, and they agreed to be interviewed because they want to show people what the process is like so that there's no confusion. So in the notes for this episode, I will share a link. Sorry, not the notes. In the blog post for this episode, I'll link each interview. I have a page that has all the interviews. And so I'll link that into the blog post so that you can go through and listen to each interview if you want to. And I wanted to let you know too, a few of the resources that I did mention throughout this episode that are available. One is my mid-career resume strategies. Again, this was a guide that was vetted by recruiters. I've had people invest in this guide already and they've seen results. And ultimately, we're trying to get you to the interview with that guide. And it has so much wonderful advice and really breaks down the resume for you. So there's no question about what you're getting. And it's really, really easy to follow. And I'll link that again in the blog post as well. And then finally, for those interested in learning more about LinkedIn and how to make an impact through LinkedIn professionally, check out my LinkedIn Level Up for the Corporate Professional. This is a self-paced course that includes 2 hours of coaching and strategy with me. Honestly, this is one of the most affordable ways to get coaching with me. We talk about LinkedIn, but we also talk about your career as a whole, where you're headed, and we make sure that your strategy aligns with that. And then I do 2 half-hour follow-up calls just to check your progress, see where you're going, and see if you need anything else. So that's a really great investment for people who need a little bit of guidance and want to really maximize their use of LinkedIn. So thank you so much for joining me on this wrap-up episode for season 8, The Recruiter's Perspective. If you have any questions, please connect with me on social media. I'm primarily on LinkedIn these days, so you can go ahead and connect with me or follow me, and I will leave a link to that in the show notes as well.